My name is Teo Grossman. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Bioneers. We have one more panel after this, and then we'll break for lunch. While we're gathering the next panel, I wanted to introduce a film, a short video message from an old colleague of Tom's who lives in Bolivia. This conference that we're having today is taking place in the context of a larger global conversation about climate change and climate negotiations. The meeting's in Lima this fall and Paris next spring. So with that, we'll launch the video. It's 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can have the next panel.
Hi, everyone, and greetings from Bolivia. My name is Jim Schultz. I am the founder and the executive director of the Democracy Center. I'm also a native Californian. I was born and raised in Whittier. I went to college at UC Berkeley, and for 20 years I worked in California politics and policy as an assistant to the legislature and as an advocate with Common Cause and Consumers Union. When my family and I moved here in 1998, there were 2 things I didn't realize. One is that 16 years later, we'd still be here. And the second is that these 2 completely different places, California and Bolivia, would both be on the front end of the crisis of our time, the crisis you're here to talk about, the climate crisis. Whether it is biblical drought in California or the melting of the glaciers here in the Andes, Bolivia and California are quite literally in the same boat. The Democracy Center works globally on 5 continents to help citizens and activists develop their strategies and campaigns, and especially on climate change. So my friends in California asked if I would speak very briefly with you by video today about the ways in which California might plant itself more assertively and strategically on the global stage. So here are 3 basic ideas. The first is there needs to be a strong California story, a California narrative that speaks to the realities of other countries. And you have that narrative. It's about the transition to clean energy. It's about how you harness that transition in the service of climate justice, the social justice, and equity, because these are the excuses that other countries like India, for example, are using to not make the transition to clean energy. The second thing, I think, as a point of strategy, is to look to the UN negotiation process as an opportunity to put California more on the global stage. It's called the Conference of the Parties, or the COP process. There's one coming up in Lima at the end of the year, which is an opportunity for California to link with Latin America and Latin American organizations. And then the all-important deadline conference in Paris next year, which is when we are supposed to have a new global agreement. So I think California needs to play a role on the stage of the COP negotiations as well, both in its government and its activists. And third, I think it's important to be truthful as California steps onto the international stage about where it fits in the jigsaw puzzle of climate. Because while California has made some really impressive progress in reducing its carbon footprint, the fact is that a good portion of that carbon footprint has simply been exported to China and other countries abroad. Every time somebody in Los Angeles or San Francisco buys a widescreen television or an iPod that was made in China, their carbon footprint has been exported abroad. And I think it's important to be honest about that and to look for ways to address California's role in the global trade system. I want to end by saying this. We face a crisis unlike anything we've ever seen. I believe that those of us, whether we're in government or whether we're activists, those of us who would have an opportunity to take leadership on a global level not only need to do that, I think we have a moral obligation to do that. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate this opportunity. I wish I could have been there with you in person, and I look forward to working with as many of you who are interested. Thank you very much.
So Jim, who made that video, Jim Schultz, anyone in the room ever heard of the California Budget Project? Raise your hand. Oh, yeah? He started it, and he's really, just as much as any of the policy insiders you've heard of from today, he has been that, and now he's on the international stage. So he asked us, this video emerged out of a conference call we had with him earlier in the week. He threw it together so he could share that content with you. But if any of you are engaged in international work or want to be, please follow up with Tom this evening or myself, and we'll make sure you get connected to Jim, because he'll be in Lima, and he really deeply believes in the California narrative being something that pushes the envelope with countries that are saying this can't be done. So we're the 8th biggest economy. We have some opportunity to act to push the envelope because of that. So I have the pleasure of introducing the next panel. It's called The California Model, Successes and Challenges, as you can see. Tom will be moderating it, and for anyone, I'm sure you heard this earlier, but Tom's with the Peace and Justice Resource Center that he founded. We also have Kim Hoffman, who's with the California Student Sustainability Alliance. My former colleague and friend, Ross Nakasone, who is with the BlueGreen Alliance and is a frequent visitor to the state capitol on clean jobs issues, clean energy jobs issues. And finally, the person you've been hearing from articulately all day, Dan Jacobson, who's the Legislative Director of Environment California. Give it up for this great panel, and then we'll have lunch.
Okay, deepening the conversation about the California model, we're going to have several panelists make comments and hopefully interact with each other, and I'll leave a very light footprint on the conversation. That'll be followed, you'll be glad to know, by a lunch break, as short as possible. And then we'll have another official from the EPA, Arsenio Mataka, who is kind of in charge of, he's kind of in charge of the environmental justice side of the equation. And all this will hopefully end in a kind of rounded out idea of how all these concepts integrate. Let's start, let's talk a little bit about successes, but more about the road ahead, the mountains ahead, the challenges ahead. And I'd like to start with Ross. We need to broaden the labor participation in the environmental movement, or environmental participation in the labor movement. What are the obstacles? What are the goals? We've heard the discussion about the great legislation to put people to work identifying and capturing methane leaks. God knows how much methane is out there already. But Ross is with the BlueGreen Alliance, which tries to bring together a group of unions with environmental groups. So Ross, take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Tom. And thanks for having the BlueGreen Alliance here. What I thought I would do is just kind of talk a little bit about who the BlueGreen Alliance is, what we do, and I think that provides a great frame for what we're talking about. But I think, you know, Vienne's comments about who, what, and how, and then Tom initially talking about kind of this integration of mainstream environmental goals around climate change, as well as environmental justice issues, really, I think, for the BlueGreen Alliance resonates. And so we would add a third sort of component to that, of course, which is labor and the importance of family-sustaining jobs. So the BlueGreen Alliance is a national coalition of labor and environmental groups committed to the idea that we can address today's environmental challenges in ways that create and maintain family-sustaining jobs and a stronger, fairer economy. So we're guided by the principle that California doesn't have to choose between economic prosperity and environmental sustainability, that in fact we can have our cake and eat it too, we can have both. And so the way we think about it is kind of like a Venn diagram where we have circles, and labor is in one circle and environmental issues are in another, and it's where they overlap when it looks kind of like, I guess, like a football or something like that. That's where kind of we feel like the BlueGreen Alliance is, and we need to make that football bigger and bigger until it ultimately becomes one circle. And so we have, you know, and so we're working towards that. And it's certainly not just the BlueGreen Alliance. A lot of folks, NRDC, Sierra Club, Union of Concerned Scientists, all the way, by the way, partners of the BlueGreen Alliance, working very hard to outreach to labor groups to build these coalitions. And so we have really great examples of where circles have overlapped. Tom mentioned SB 1371 by Senator Leno, a fairly nuanced bill, but ultimately its goal is to speed up and reduce fugitive methane emissions coming from our natural gas distribution pipeline. So it's really good on the jobs front, really important for the environmental justice community, and of course, reducing methane, you know, a very potent greenhouse gas. Another really good example of kind of this idea of strong coalitions overlapping is with the low carbon fuel standard. The United Steelworkers, who represent a good slug of refinery workers here in California, you might think would be naturally allergic to, basically reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Particularly, of course, as it relates to transportation. But they have, in fact, embraced AB 32 generally, and specifically the low-carbon fuel standard, really seeing it as an opportunity to transform their industry. Not that it will go away and they will die off, but that it will become something else, that it will actually evolve over time. And so these, for me, are really good examples of where we have that strong overlap, issue by issue, on specific issues, of our labor and our environmental partners. And there are other examples. For example, the renewable portfolio standard. A number of our labor partners have really benefited from that, utility scale solar to be sure. But there have been we've generated hundreds of thousands of jobs, hundreds of thousands of job hours, thousands of jobs, really that are family sustaining, really great jobs. High-speed rail, also again controversial, but really intended to create prevailing wage jobs in the Central Valley where they are really needed most. So. Coalitions are good, they're important. For the Blue-Green Alliance, it's just frankly the right thing to do. And so you think about environmental justice, mainstream environmentals, now we're talking about adding in labor. But frankly, the political analysis finds that labor support for AB 32 broadly is necessary, to build the political power to combat, manufacturers in the oil industry who are really trying to undo a lot of the work or, ultimately end our work in 2020. So having labor on board, frankly, is necessary just from the political landscape. And so we've had pretty good successes, I think, engaging unions just on the broad notion of AB 32. They were supportive of the passage of AB 32 way at the beginning. They were really strongly opposed to Proposition 23 back in 2010 that would have undone California's clean energy and climate law. And we've seen just this year their serious engagement on AB 69, the effort to actually repeal or I guess delay or exempt, I think is the language you're using, the oil industry from the cap and trade program. They really came out in strong opposition to any efforts to do that. So that was really nice. But the challenge, I think, is how to develop deeper, more significant union engagement on AB 32. So, back to that Venn diagram. I think if you look at unions, and I should note, and I should have probably done this early, that unions are a very diverse group of people, and they are not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination. But looking at, kind of that circle, and trying to understand where union motivations are, I think, is important. I think on average, on balance, you're going to get a lot of unions nodding their head, climate change bad, addressing climate change good. But where does it fall in that circle? And I think for some of our union partners and allies, it really does fall in the outer perimeters, right at the boundaries of AB 32. So something that they will agree with, but not at the core. So proverbially speaking, up in Sacramento, you might get a Me Too out of that. But really, is it a place where it's deep in their hearts? I'm not sure. And I think there's a lot of work necessary in order to have that happen. And we've seen other instances where that actually has happened. Immigration and healthcare, even healthcare not related to healthcare workers. These are things that are really at the core of a lot of labor's movements, even though it's not necessarily to their kind of genuine or kind of raison d'etre core, which is about family-sustaining jobs. So I think there's a lot more work there about kind of who, what, and how, kind of like what Vienne was talking about. But sort of the obverse side of that coin then is looking at the environmentalist circle. I think AB 32 probably falls pretty darn close to the center of that circle. It really is a core issue for a lot of environmentalists. So where do family-sustaining jobs, where do those sort of components fall within their circle? I would wonder if it's kind of more towards the boundaries, more towards the outer sides of that circle, or more towards the center. So as we move forward, I think the challenge is trying to get those circles to overlap more and to have each of these kind of communities really start to embrace new and different ideas as we start to move forward, kind of looking towards 2050.
Great, thanks. Katie Hoffman is a representative of many students who have been fighting for divestment from fossil fuels at the university and perhaps in the public employees retirement system in the future. And we've been working on possible legislation for January, but I thought it would be very important for her to catch you up on where the students are, what the outcome with the university was, and where they're thinking about moving forward from here. So this is Katie Hoffman. You met her before when she narrated the film that you might have seen or missed at 8:55 this morning. Good morning again, and thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks everyone for being here. So, as he said, my name is Katie Hoffman. I'm a recent graduate from UC Berkeley, and when I was going to Cal, I helped start the UC divestment campaign at Berkeley, and we were initially, in 2011, among 6 schools across the nation that were focusing on using the tactic of divestment, which is the opposite of investment, to target the fossil fuel company and essentially remove their social license to operate by generating and creating a political movement that could do that. And I have to say we've been pretty darn successful. Since 2012, and it was mentioned earlier in the Do the Math tour that Bill McKibben spearheaded with 350.org, there are now more than 400 campuses across the United States focusing on the Divest Invest campaign. And we are targeting not just coal, but oil and natural gas, because we can't continue to invest in fracking. So we are now at, like I said, 400 campuses across the nation, and the University of California, which is a $91 billion portfolio, we've been active in the campaign for 3 years, and we now spread across the entire state with almost 10 out of the 11 campuses focusing and running active campaigns. So it's been a hard fight. And there's been a lot of learning involved. I am not a finance expert, but a lot of this campaign and what it has done is it's actually opened up the black box of finance and that relationship between finance and fossil fuels and how that is driving and fueling climate change. So at the University of California, recently, we've been pushing for full divestment from the top 200 fossil fuel companies with the largest carbon reserves. They have in their proven reserves 5 times the safe limit that we know we can burn in order to avoid 2 degrees of warming, which was agreed upon in Copenhagen in 2009. And these companies are spending collectively $686 roughly billion a year to continue looking for new reserves, even though we know their proven reserves can't be burnt in order for us to have a livable planet. So as young people, we're really concerned about this, and we're using the tactics at our disposal, like divestment, to really shift the debate and also in the future, shift investment into the solutions that are actually going to grow a just transition to a renewable energy economy that is strong enough to lift people out of poverty and grow jobs that people, that are my age actually want to do. And at UC, we did have some recent success, even though we did not get divestment. We were able to get them to get anti-divestment language out of the policy recommendation that they put forth, because at the time it was investment professionals actually that were tasked with looking into the issue of climate change. We actually had someone who denied whether climate change was real on our task force. So that was very interesting, and it was definitely a long struggle over the summer to really work with the investment office as young people and say, hey, this is a financial issue. It's also a moral issue, and we need this institution, which is here to serve the public good, to really take a stand on this issue and stand on the right side of history. What we got was a policy that is moving forward $1 billion of investment in climate solutions over the next 5 years, and a promise to create an environmental social governance policy that will guide the investment office in how it addresses investments in the future. Now, we are still pushing for divestment. That is a hard line in the sand. We hold as a campaign and across the entire nation that you cannot continue investing in the source of the issue. And just investing in solutions is not actually addressing the political needs that we have to take on the fossil fuel industry. But with this environmental social governance policy, we are really in an exciting place to start building coalition with folks outside of the institution who have a stake in the UC, because it is a public institution, the flagship of this state. To really shape what that looks like and how that $1 billion of climate solutions, which we are going to push to make sure that it's more, that's less than 0.5% of the portfolio right now. We're gonna push for 5%, and how that can actually shift into growing the vision put forth by the 535 Coalition, by the communities that are most impacted by the industry right now, and to really shift into an economy that we want, and that our institutions should be both producing research on, since we are one of the foremost research institutions in the world, researching climate change and how we can solve these things, and investing in those solutions. So it's a really exciting time to both be involved in this campaign and to see it grow, as we recently saw the Rockefeller Family Fund just divested, and we got 700 high net worth individuals and 67 foundations, totaling roughly $50 billion to commit to the Divest Invest initiative before the UN Climate Summit a couple weeks ago in New York. So this is a really exciting time, and we're moving forward, and we hope that as we push to Paris, the University of California will really lead the way and show other states that flagship public institutions take investment in climate solutions seriously and will not continue to invest their portfolios in the causes and the root causes of the problem.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you. And then back to Dan, who's the real pivotal person in Sacramento, and he reads the political ecology there very carefully, and I think that he's really fit to be the person that talks about the challenge within the state political culture, including the PUC that we've talked about, the governor's office, and the balance of forces in the legislature, where the oil and gas lobby fits in, and where seats are really contested, and why there were only 15 votes in the Democratic Senate for a moratorium on fracking, and so on. So Dan,
16.
What failed there? What's the matter? How do we get to 21?
I feel like you're blaming me, Senator, and I don't, but I'll take that. Let me say a couple of things. I think we've spent some time talking today about how lucky we are to have Governor Brown as our governor, Senator DeLeon as the pro tem, and Speaker Atkins as our new speaker. And I agree. The three of them have a real vision on the environment, and I think they want us to be able to push for campaigns that will keep carbon in the ground and be able to move us to a clean energy economy. The problem is that while Brown wants to do this, and those other two leaders want to do that, they face a lot of headwind. And it is going to be up to us to supply them with the backwind, or the wind at their backs, in order for us to move. And I wanted to talk about a couple of the dangers or the problems that I see coming up, and then riff a little bit about what Ross was saying about the Venn diagram and sort of ways to expand that Venn diagram, and give some examples about where that's really worked. This will be the year that, as you've probably heard, fuels come under the cap, and what that means in less than a minute is that the law that we passed in 2006, AB 32, the universal we passed in 2006, requires that if you're a polluter, you have to pay to be able to pollute. It's the cap and trade system. The first groups to go under that were the utilities, and then in 2015, the oil companies will go under that cap. So in order for them to sell oil in the state of California, they're going to need to buy these permits, and that cost of those permits will go up, and they're supposed to reduce the amount of CO2 that they're putting into the air every single year. So this is the first time that fuels will come under the cap, and Annie Nodoff and others had been saying that because of that, the oil companies are using this as an opportunity to extend the fight that they have put into place since 2006. They not only fought us every step of the way in passing that bill, but they've done at least 2 or 3 lawsuits where they've challenged the legitimacy of AB 32. They've put bills in almost every single year that says that we should delay AB 32, and then people remember Prop 23, where they were trying to repeal AB 32 outright. This is yet another step for them, but it'll be a very, has the potential to be a very powerful one, because as fuels come under the cap, they will blame any increase in the gas prices on that issue. Blaming the increase in gas prices on environmental programs hits one of our key constituencies in Sacramento that we need to be able to have on our side, which is the moderate Democrats. And as much as we can say that Brown is with us and that DeLeon is with us and that Atkins is with us, The moderate Democrats and their rise to power over the past 10 years has really taken the place, as you've seen sort of the Republican Party almost crash and burn in California and lose its significance in California politics. They're not even included in the budget discussions that happen. It used to be called the Big Five when Senator Hayden was in there, because in order to get the votes that they needed, they had to negotiate with the Republican Party. At this point, they don't need to, and those meetings are now referred to as the Big Three. So we've seen a decline in the relevance of the Republican Party, but that doesn't mean that the people that influence the Republican Party have lost any of their influence. They've just switched from the Republican Party now to these moderate Democratic seats in California. And that's why when you look at the fracking vote and you go, well, you only got 16 votes in the Senate, which had, at the time, this was before indictments, 25 Democrats. It's true. 25 Democrats in there. Why couldn't you get that? Is what everyone kept, you know, for a lot of the tough votes that we have on our clean energy or on our carbon reduction programs, people are going, well, why can't you get up to 21? And in the assembly, where it's an 80-person assembly, and so you need 41, and we've got at least 53, I might be wrong, 55 Democrats in there. People ask the same question is, why can't we just write bills like we used to do in the old days on the back of a napkin, get Senator Burton to introduce it, and it would pass immediately? Those days are gone, in essence, because of that problem that we're seeing. So the decrease in the Republican Party's significance and power in Sacramento has led to a rise of these moderate Democrats, and what we're seeing now is very well-funded political campaigns on behalf of the oil companies and the other fossil fuel companies into some of these key areas. And so if you look at some of the key races that will be coming up in the next 3 or 4 weeks, you're seeing millions of dollars being spent by those groups to try to influence, even in some of the races where it's a D versus D, in order to influence who will be the better Democrat for the fossil fuel industry. And that is, as it falls into whether it's ads, whether it's research, or whether it's elections, it's the money that the fossil fuel groups will spend that will create the headwind against us and our political leaders who are on our side. That's what we ultimately need to be fighting. And I think the way that we need to do that is exactly what Ross was saying with the Venn diagram, but I see it as more than just as a circle of two, labor and the environment, but what we're going to need to do is to create a lot more circles that can intersect there. So obvious ones will be students, and having the student movement re-engaged will be critical. Environmental justice has been a critical one, and the work that Vienna and others have done is critical. As Ross is saying, we have labor, and there is, for that sort of first time, and in probably California, it's the best as anywhere in the country where there is overlap, but we're going to need to see more overlap from, I've just had 3 groups here, but there's probably more, and I should say clean energy, we're in pretty good shape with them. But the 3 that we need more support from are ag, a powerful constituency in the state of California. Almost nothing gets done without them. What I'll call the Silicon Valley billionaires. So they're out there doing stuff, but sometimes you kind of go, it'd be a little more helpful if you were in this direction. And then 3 is figuring out a way in which to continue to engage the Hollywood community. And say what you will about it, but many of those people in the Hollywood community have 2 things. One is the understanding on how to communicate complicated ideas like climate change and carbon pollution very effectively and very easily. And 2 is many of these people have 11, 12 million followers on Twitter or Facebook or email or what have you. Patrick, who's the guy that just got asked to host the Oscars? Neil Patrick Harris. I was going to make an analogy between me and him and the Oscars and Bioneers today, but I passed that. But assume that's the case. Environment California, we have about 8,000 Twitter followers, and in the news when I was reading about that guy, he has 11 million Twitter followers. The ability in which to engage that group, as the same with the others, the billionaires have the resources, ag has the political power. We're going to need to expand our Venn diagram so it's a lot of those groups coming together with the center point being climate and clean energy. And those will be the places that will need to work for the next couple of years to create the wind at our elected officials' backs that they'll need to fight off the oil companies. For the past couple of years, the oil guys have had a big party, in essence, and everyone goes to their event. What we're trying to do is through programs and campaigns and policies that we run both at the state level, at the city level, on the college campuses, is to bring those other powerful political constituencies in the state of California to the side of a clean environment and to be able to reduce the amount of climate and to put the oil guys at their own party by themselves. And that's where we need to go.
So Dan, let me start with you, and then all three of you can respond as you like to this question. This is all about how we widen the base, and explain if there are 15 or 16 Democratic Senate votes for a moratorium on fracking, and there were 10 more Democrats or 5 more who would not vote. Let's be specific. What districts are they from? What are their names? And what is the general social composition of that district? That's the first question. And then the second related is, isn't it true that the resources of organized environmentalism are largely based in universities and coastal districts? And the Democrats who are holding off are generally in the Central Valley and down to Kern County. And is the environmental movement not wholly lacking in base building resources and political investment in those areas? Isn't the solution to organize the environmental movement in the areas where those 5 senators sit? And how on earth do you do that? Why is it so difficult with millions of dollars in environmental organizational budgets?
That's a lot of questions, and let me
It's
try
really
to,
one.
I don't know if I can do it that quickly.
It's really one question. You know that.
Yeah. I always feel bad when you ask me these questions. Let me try to say it from 2 points. I think there's plenty of places where we can go and give the names of the assembly members and senators who have not been good on these issues. And there was a letter that was circulated by Assembly Member Perea, who might be the head of what is often referred to as the Moderate Caucus or the MOD Caucus. And he got 16 assembly members to sign on to a letter to Mary Nichols saying that we should look at delaying fuels coming under the cap. And then if you look at the votes on fracking, you would see whether it was Senator Correa, who was Orange County, whether it was Senator Hernandez, just from eastern part of Los Angeles, and a whole set of others who took a walk or didn't vote on that issue. I think there's 2 things that, let me just say 2 things and I'll pass this question down the line. The first is, to answer your question, yes, I think it would be much better if environmental groups would spend more resources organizing, period. You know, I think if we try to get into an arms race of we're going to outspend the oil industry, that's a fool's place to spend our money. But being able to have people going door to door, holding community meetings, doing exactly what so many of us in this room know how to do and do fairly well into communities throughout the whole state of California, that's going to be the critical thing. How we get the resources to be able to do that, how we reallocate the resources, as you're saying, that'll be the key place that we can do. The other thing I would just say, though, is that oftentimes when you look at the, there's a tactic that we've always used in the past, and I want to just bring it up, is that we go, oh, well, look at Senator Laura. He's taken millions of dollars from the oil companies, and that's impacting his vote. The other way to look at this is that he's in a fairly difficult position because he's in a very safe district, and if he wants to take on a leadership role within the Senate, the only way that he can do that is to raise a lot of money. So that is a bigger problem that we have. So when these guys go out and get the money from pharmaceutical companies, from insurance companies, from oil companies, it then becomes a 2-edged problem. One is that they're taking this money, and every bad vote that they put out there will tag them and go, that's the problem. But if you talk to these guys, a lot of them are trying to use their newfound power to be able to push for stronger legislation. So some of the bills that you were referencing this morning, SB 605, which deals with short-lived climate pollutants, which is the word that I know that we want to get rid of immediately, or SB 1204, which helps to electrify our freight, bus, trains, and trucks in the state of California, were both pushed for and took a lot of political capital by Senator Lara. But oftentimes, the only thing that we'll see is, oh, wait, he was the chair of the Latino caucus, and they took tens of thousands of dollars from the oil companies. Well, he would argue, I think, he did that so he could get in the position that he was to pass those bills. It's putting us in a difficult spot to be able to do. If we criticize him for taking that money, we lose his support to be able to do the bills. But if we don't criticize it, we're missing sort of an easy opportunity to go, hey, what the heck, you're taking this oil company money. That doesn't seem right to us. You got to be better than that. There's a bigger problem that we'll ultimately have to solve, sort of the money in politics problem. We've done that, I think, every 2 years. We have ballot measures on there that try to take money out of politics in one form or another. The latest being is the term limits thing. Is that what's work? I'm getting off your topic, so let me apologize and pause and move on down the line.
A couple of thoughts here. Labor has different relationships. You know, there are a lot of relationships that labor has up in Sacramento overlap, I think, with environmentalists. But they do have relationships that perhaps the environmental community does not have with certain members. And so, to the extent that you know, these issues can become core to labor organizations, I think that would be valuable. That, you know, currently, again, you know, Me Too, that's a place that we can often find labor organizations, but really expending hard political capital for things like AB 32 and climate change is hard. But if we can actually bring that issue to the core of some of these labor unions, I think we would be able to get access to more of that political capital. And then, of course, a further reach beyond, you know, kind of the overlap of environmentalists' influence and labor's influence, right, to really access that area that environmentalists cannot currently capture. But I did want to kind of slightly changing topics a little bit, but you had sort of talked about districts, and so I wanted to kind of take that opening. You know, Annie had talked about inside game and outside game. So we have gotten some, I think, fairly high level, that is to say, you know, broad but not particularly deep support from the labor community on things like AB 32 and climate change, and that's been great. But now we can actually then leverage that with our local unions, right? The ones on the ground in districts, saying, well, you know, up in Sacramento, John Youngdahl and, you know, Art and the rest of the gang are saying AB 32 is important. What are you guys doing? Can Blue-Green Alliance, can hopefully labor groups, can hopefully environmental justice groups and student groups meet with these local unions locally in you know, counties and in districts and say, what can we do? How can we work together? Build momentum, build interest, build support, their engagement on AB 32, and ideally their actual direct benefits from AB 32 then will translate to meaning for them. They will be talking then to their state councils and saying, for sure now AB 32 can't go away. We are getting jobs from it. We are getting direct benefits. And so that's sort of the strategy that we're trying to play with, both up in Sacramento, kind of creating that initial room, and then getting down into the field, down into these districts, and actually, you know, being concrete about what AB 32 means to people in the communities, so that we get bigger buy-in, and then, of course, have that flow back up. That's sort of the strategy we're working on. Hard, easy to say, hard to do.
Katie.
Yeah, so from a perspective of a young person who actually came into environmental and climate work through a human rights perspective and a health perspective, I think it's really important to actually discuss where youth are at right now in this changing movement that we're a part of. You know, many of us don't call ourselves environmental activists. In fact, we are challenging the notion of what environmentalism is, right? And the privilege that has come along with that term. And how that affects race and class. And one thing that I see in the youth, and what I really think that we can bring to this larger coalition that we're trying to build, is growing solidarity with folks outside of traditional environmental communities and showing up for them. And rebranding and messaging the type of work that we do to really address issues of social justice, not through the traditional environmental lens or reducing carbon in the atmosphere. And youth in the climate movement now are acutely aware of this, and they are working diligently on growing our base so that we can really relate and reach out to folks who have been left out of the environmental movement. So one example of this and the political power that we're building through solidarity is just last weekend, tons of climate activists, working on anti-fracking in Pennsylvania or working, here in California, took buses to Ferguson to show solidarity with the folks in Ferguson. And that wasn't about reducing carbon in the atmosphere. That was about showing up. And now we are trying to build a climate movement that can really do that, show up and build genuine relationships so that when we are looking to address substantive policy change, we have a broad-based coalition that is unified by a common vision, one that's focused on justice. And I think that that's really going to be the next big step that the youth are continuing to engage in, but it takes time. And working with communities who have been historically disenfranchised and left out of the conversation, divested from, that's going to take a lot of time. And I think that that's the only genuine way, though, to build a political movement strong enough to transition our economy and society beyond fossil fuels and the injustices perpetuated by the industry.
So, just to be clear, the pattern that I'm seeing here is that through the combination of AB 32, which is a market mechanism, and 535 and others that require co-benefits to disadvantaged communities, that's paralleled by this idea of divest and invest as opposed to just divest. And as a practical matter, it means that you can go to poor communities, working class communities, labor organizations, environmental justice groups, and say there's tangible benefits here for you through this broader coalition, broader benefits, and that consolidates maybe enough of a political base to keep these programs safe from the attack of the fossil fuel industry. Is that a fair enough practical explanation of what you're trying to do, or is it more moral?
I think it's both. I think you can't separate finances and morality in the world that we live in. And the fact that that's been what's happening, I mean, on steroids since the 70s, is really one of the problems we're facing, right? And when I say, historically marginalized communities, we need to build coalition with them, when you look at, you parallel those communities and the investment that's gone into those communities, you can really see it's stark. They have been divested from the state, right, from industry, and they have become, in some ways, dependent on the fossil fuel industry for jobs. So we have to help break that stranglehold, because I mean, divest, invest, and the students working on it, we are aware that you can't say, okay, divest from fossil fuels and we want to put all the coal workers out of their jobs, but those folks are actually the victims in many ways of the system that's creating that poverty. And we want to transition that by shifting investment and shifting substantive policies that will foster the types of investment that will give communities resources to lift themselves out of poverty.
And does this UC policy, which I read, it contains this phrase that you passed over rather quickly, the adoption by UC of a new criteria to judge their investments by, which is called a social, what
environmental social governance.
Social governance policy. Is that a sophisticated way to allow them to take more than profit into consideration? Is that an opening towards social investments?
Right, yeah, so that is our goal, to actually have a policy that both provides a base for the UC to evaluate in every single way that it invests in all elements of the portfolio, the impact of that investment on the environment and on society, which are interconnected. And also to have a clear criteria for those companies and those industries that cannot be invested in by these set of principles. And we're in that process of really shaping those principles, and the visioning is actually a way for us to build a coalition around what folks in California would like to see their premier public institution investing in, and what those policies should look like, so that it's investing back in to our state and the wealth of our communities.
Either of you guys want to add on to what Katie's answered here?
I don't want to add on to the moral piece, but I'll add on to what I thought was your earlier. I agree. just to be simple. But let me give an example of a place where it sort of plays out in the world of politics. So high-speed rail is an issue where some environmentalists have been, well, you know, the concept is good, but we don't like it, and not over here, and not over there. There's a whole set of problems with it. But the governor did a move about 6-8 months ago that was a very, very sophisticated move and plays into a lot of what we're talking about. Exactly. He said that we're going to fund high-speed rail by the money from fuels under the cap. That was a really important thing that he said, because aside from the environmentalists that do like high-speed rail, the #1 group in the state that likes high-speed rail is labor. So once you had labor saying 25% of the money to build this program that they love almost as much as anything is going to come from fuels under the cap, and when some of the moderate Democrats then wrote that letter to Mary Nichols saying, hey, we want to delay fuels under the cap, instead of it just being environmentalists going up to those particular legislators and saying, gee, you know, we're really concerned about this letter that you wrote, what a difference it is when our buddies over here, fingers pounding in chest saying, get name off letter, makes a huge difference in that world. And I think that's an example of where you bring those two things together, and the power is so much bigger than just the moral environmentalists or whatever going up and saying, gee, we're a little concerned about this letter.
Also, if I may, just before Ross, the governor's office has been trying to persuade me of high-speed rail for a long time, and I'm impossible. I'm like with Henry David Thoreau or somebody. But the latest argument, in keeping with what you said, that seems somewhat persuasive now that they're going to spend the money anyway, is that whether or not the rail actually gets built, which removes me from having to believe in it, under state law, they have to invest tons of money, millions of dollars, in the infrastructure and reforestation and soil preservation and efficiencies precisely in the Senate districts we're talking about, precisely in Kern County. And precisely the money will go into the hands of workers in those areas. So it will be a green advance before any train is in sight. I may not even be alive before this train ever gets where the governor thinks it will be. He, of course, will be alive, but that I just
still the governor, probably.
I just throw that out. No, he'll be the mayor of Oakland, actually, waiting for a chance. But it does signify some smart thinking there about how to allocate money into jobs and green development in these areas where there's no environmentalists in sight except some really brave small groups. Ross, go ahead.
I mean, yes, all correct. And you know, it's a really sort of kind of political analysis that we've been conducting here, and it makes me feel just slightly uncomfortable with the idea of it sounding fairly transactional in nature.
Please be my guest. I'm corrupt. What do you offer? What do you have to offer?
Well, I mean, the notion that, you know, jobs in the Central Valley, you know, ideally prevailing wage jobs in the Central Valley where unemployment is high, where you have a lot of union workers on the bench, putting them to work is a good thing.
Yes,
and
that's right.
that you know, putting them to work using AB $32 is a good thing. That I feel like it doesn't need to be, but I posit that could actually be part of our embrace as a whole, and it is not just a matter of getting unions that have large political contributions to moderate Democrats, and that's why we're going to invest in high-speed rail. I think really we need to be looking at the broader sort of notion of environmental groups really sort of taking to heart the idea that family-sustaining jobs matter too. And so kind of the threat, though, on that, or the obverse on that is, you know, kind of, we don't have coal jobs here in California, but that's a good example of, you know, if we are looking to divest from coal and ultimately have coal go away, there are workers who work in coal mines, coal miners,
yes.
And they will no longer work in coal mines if you know, things go the way as we anticipate they would go. if I'm a coal miner, I get very nervous. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And there needs to be not necessarily, and this sounds like, transitional assistance or, that sort of stuff, just transition. I get very nervous around those terms, but we need to really be thinking about how our jobs, how our economy transforms itself in a very, I don't know if gentle is the right word, but in a way where people know what's going to happen tomorrow, and that they have confidence that they are not going to be ending up working at McDonald's or those sort of things. We talk about quality, or we talk about jobs in a lot of the green economy. Are they good jobs? Are they jobs that actually you can make your rent, raise kids? Do they actually have career pathways? Those are the kind of questions that I think the environmental community could think about more, embrace a little bit more.
One related issue that I thought would come up, but I haven't seen, I haven't heard today, is healthcare. It's a very large sector of the economy. All kinds of groups like the Lung Association, pediatricians, climate parents are very concerned about worker health, children's health, and so on. Katie spoke of cancer in her family in the moving first segment of that film. Isn't it possible that the image of the environmental warriors of the future a nurse? Do people not think of that? Do they always think of images of leadership on the ground coming from the counterculture or the universities? Isn't healthcare like one of the 2 or 3 largest sectors of our economy? Isn't the National Nurses Union out there fighting a battle? Where does we're living in a state of emergency that's not declared, and the first effect is health, is disease, is we have a whole generation that will live shorter lives than their parents. That is the first time in the history of this country. Not only do they have economic problems, jobs problems, not only do they hear that the world is ending as they try to grow up, but they're not going to live as long. They're going to have more diseases, and most of those diseases are related to environmental medicine. So where does that health issue fit into the constituency or coalition you're trying to build?
Go ahead.
Well, let me just say that, the California Nurses Association, by the way, not a partner of the BlueGreen Alliance, but obviously an ally, they've been heavily engaged on these sort of issues. They've been at the fore, and it's been really great. But kind of just more broadly, I think there are a lot of so many ideas come to my mind. There are, I think, particular environmental justice issues, but obviously health issues, since those oftentimes coincide. I think those are things, when you look at that kind of that circle of where folks are, I think for a lot of unions, those get much closer than, kind of climate change and PPM and that sort of stuff. And I think health, obviously, one of those that really does resonate. I feel like that's kind of a closer sort of nexus, of overlap between a lot of groups. That being said, labor is very diverse, and there are other unions that perhaps health issues don't resonate as well with.
Katie?
Is that good?
I definitely have a lot to say on this topic, so keeping it focused would be difficult at the moment. Did you want to say anything, Dan?
I'll say you think, and that'll be better, because you'll say things much smarter and better than I will. But let me just start off with this. I think that when we started with the environmental movement and talking about climate change, I think Wade said it first, we mostly talked about polar bears and ice caps melting. And that's mostly how this issue was brought up. It was penguins, it was the polar bears. It's only in the past couple of years, as the impacts have gotten worse and worse and worse at the local level, where we've seen whether it's people being displaced because of the fires. Extreme weather is no longer sort of this freak thing that happens, but we almost expect it all the time. The governor has said that California is the what's his exact word, I forgot, but the epicenter of so much of what is wrong with the climate. The droughts, the fires, the rising seas, all these things will have a significant impact on California. As that translates into people's lives, from the healthcare perspective, that's where we're going to need to re-engage and not just look at this as a polar bear issue, but as a people issue. Right. And the more that this becomes a people issue, and I would argue, and then pass it as eloquently as I can to you, students looking at this from that perspective, I think we have a real opportunity for the change.
Yeah, so I guess just briefly what I'll say to kind of piggyback off of that is that for the longest time we've looked at, so I'll speak from cancer, heart disease, as those things are unfortunately in my family. I did grow up also next to 2 refineries, so interesting connection, but correlation does not equal causation in our system. And the shift that I would really like to see happen both culturally and within our academic institutions and within our policy is one to precaution, prevention, and the focus on cumulative impacts of pollution, toxins in our environment, and taxing the sources of that. So if you are polluting a stream and that causes people to fall ill, that should be priced on your tab, and it should not be externalized to the taxpayers. And we have to start talking about that. And I also think counter to that, we spend more than any other developed country on healthcare, and our outcomes are not nearly where they would be in terms of GDP and people actually getting better, right? So we have this incredibly sophisticated health system, and as my mom has gone through it, just a funny tangent, but she's getting her chemotherapy, and then the only food that's available to her at the cafeteria is hot dogs. What's up with that? Why aren't we incentivizing local organic food within these hospitals so that we can actually close that loop? And I think that it's innovations like that that will actually both grow the economy and address some of the root causes of health issues within our institutions that we haven't looked at before.
Well, when we talk about co-benefits under 535 for disadvantaged communities, the health benefits are huge potential, and everybody understands it. According to the UN, and we're working under these guidelines, in the next 15 years, if we use what we already know how to use today and go after these short-lived climate pollutants, which should be renamed by the end of this conference. Black carbon, methane, HFCs. You can get emissions of 40% of methane, 80% of black carbon, 80% from HFCs, and those deliver, and I want to underscore these words, immediate and tangible benefits in better air quality and health. Immediate and tangible. And that's the corner we have to turn if we can ever get on top of this problem. Because if we try to rest on our achievements, it's getting worse anyway. We have to find another set of measures which are considered extreme now, but people will be begging for in 5 years. And it seems to be in this area if we attach all of your suggestions to health. I don't know, for example, what resources the health community has, but they certainly would be very beneficial at promoting organizing in those hospitals in Kern County, in those hospitals in the Central Valley, and making it a health project to save the earth. So I think we have to now go to a break. I know that's kind of a radical idea at this meeting. And I hope you find some way to use your time and enjoy lunch, and we'll be back within an hour. Teo is in charge. Thanks very much for your conversation.